And in this segment of the Cyber Leaders Exchange, we're glad to be joined by Egon Rinderer. He is with NinjaOne Public Sector. And thanks so much for doing this, Egon. We'll talk through some technology topics as we go here, but wanted to sort of get your sense of the broad government marketplace as of now in terms of what you're hearing and sort of the sense of things that's out there right now from potential government customers.
Appreciate you giving me the time today too, as well. I think there is always this requirement on our part as vendors to be empathetic towards the difficulty of being in a leadership role in government. But I do think that is even more so incumbent upon us today, simply because of the downward pressure that leaders are experiencing right now, not only in terms of just general spend and the need to reduce the overall spend, especially in cost centers, IT being probably one of the top topics that we're hearing about just in general. If you look at some of the news that we've seen about Doge, the desire to consolidate contracts, things like that. But it's also in terms of headcount. And I think one of the things that we have to be cognizant of, it's in the federal space, it's always been a little bit easy to fall into that trap of, well, there's always money, there's always a budget. Even if the budget doesn't pass, there's a CR, there's ways around it. We can get creative. The reality is, these leaders are being held to the same standard, and I would argue those standards, those regulatory issues that they have to live by, the standards they have to uphold in terms of security and compliance and those sorts of things are actually increasing. It's not as though they're being told, look, you have to spend less and you have to do your job with fewer people, but we're going to make your job easier. They're actually being told you have to spend less, you have to do your job with fewer people, all while that job is becoming more difficult as time passes. So it's sort of this trifecta that it just adds massive amounts of pressure to their ability to make decisions. And one of the dangers that you get into with that is you can get into a gridlock situation where, frankly, the easiest thing to do is nothing. And we all know that's not the answer, right? And so then we have to take a very pragmatic approach and say, okay, well, what are the problems we're trying to solve? And rationally speaking, logically speaking, let's talk through that. And let's start mapping out ways that we can reduce spend. Let's start mapping out ways that we can do the things that we have to do and meet the regulatory requirements with 30% fewer staff or whatever that threshold is.
Yeah, the things becoming more difficult alongside all of the rest of the challenges that you mentioned is an interesting piece of it. What are the biggest ways that that's manifesting itself right now that you see? Because I think that has a bearing on some of the solutions and approaches that
Yeah.
you're going to end up offering.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had a meeting yesterday where we were discussing this, and I was sitting down and having a conversation with a government leader, and she made the comment. She was talking about like just the role of executing contracts, right? Something that is part and parcel to the day-to-day life of what she does in government. And she made mention that she had over 1,500 contracts backlogged just to execute, right? Each one of those contracts represents something that needs to happen, right? Someone has made a decision, they've obligated dollars, they need to get things moving, and it really boils down to staffing. She has the cognizance to say, I'm not going to just rubber stamp these things. I need to actually review them and do my job. And you see that across the board, right? Whether it's someone working in the IT shop, whether it's someone working in leadership, you have this nucleus of people who care deeply about doing their job the right way, and they're being asked to do, in a lot of cases, I think more than is reasonable for a person to be able to do, right? And so you extrapolate that out into the day-to-day activities that are required just to run sort of the infrastructure that's required for these people to do their jobs. Those, you can't have those things piling up, right? Just like you can't have contracts piling up, because that stops the progress that needs to be made on whatever those contracts are associated with. Yeah, that's true in other areas. It's true of patching computers. It's true of, maintaining a certain security threshold and reducing vulnerability and not making yourself a soft target to our adversaries and those sorts of things. It's true in the military. It's true everywhere in government. And then that trickles down to us, right? To taxpayers, the services that we are provided by government. And we feel that pain. It's not just those leaders who are experiencing that pain. That pain gets, trickles down to everyone. And so I think it really boils down to, we hear a lot about public-private partnering and, government working with the private sector to make things better. We need to take that very seriously as vendors, as the vendor community, as the contract shops, the service providers, those sorts of things. It's not should not be paying lip service to that. We would need to really sit down and have those conversations with government leaders to help them through this situation because it's not going to get any easier anytime soon.
Yeah, and it strikes me that to a very large extent, all of the issues that a lot of that implicates is stuff that we've been talking about in the federal government space for a long time. It
Absolutely.
just adds additional, I don't know, poignancy and urgency to it. Things like the need to simplify every single agency's IT
Right.
landscape. Let's start there. I mean,
Sure.
what does simplification look like to you in 2025? And what are the specific things that the landscape that you just described bears on for that?
Yeah, and I'm going to double down on the point you made. We have been talking about this for decades, right? And to the point that it almost becomes cliche, right? To talk about, and then you start throwing around sales terminology. But the reality here, government, if you look at the people in government in the roles that are handling, like whether we talk about simplification or cost reduction or whatever it is in the IT space, the people that fill those roles in government turn over rapidly. If you compare it to private sector, right? You might have someone in private sector who is the IT lead for a shop for decades, literally. In government, you're very, very fortunate if you get 2 to 3 years out of a person in a seat, and then they're going to turn over. And so when we talk about reduction of complexity, a lot of people want to look at that from the perspective of how do I simplify my network architecture? How do I simplify the distribution of desktop systems out there, and how do I standardize and those sorts of things? I think the reality, the things that we need to take a really hard look at from the systems and the platforms, and in a lot of cases, just the endpoint tooling that we use today. What's ramp time? What's time to value? How long does it take if I have to put a new person in the driver's seat? How long does it take that person to become truly proficient in that platform? Right? Is it weeks? Do I measure it in weeks, in days, in months? Excuse me. In a lot of cases, if you look at the legacy systems that are in use in government, they do lag the private sector. Not as bad as they used to, really. But the real hallmark of legacy technology systems is that they take a very, very long time to get value out of. And that's a compound problem. It's a problem that it's very difficult to master those systems, to build proficiency in those systems. I'm, thinking back to over my decades in the space, a lot of the legacy platforms that are used for what I would call just sort of the generic day-to-day IT management, endpoint management, it's a year or better to truly master the use of those systems. So I'm going to spend a year becoming proficient, and then if you're lucky, you're going to get another year out of me in terms of actually being proficient and doing the job, right? And then I'm going to turn over, and you're going to put somebody else in that seat, and hopefully you can find somebody who already has some experience with that platform. But we also have this problem of those legacy systems, and the people who are very good at them are either aging out or they're leaving government and going to private sector for any number of reasons. And that's always been a struggle. So I think that complexity question comes down to what's the time to value? And if you're looking at a new platform, if you're looking at a new tool for use, and maybe it's to displace some legacy things, hopefully it is, because we desperately need to do that. I think there's another conversation to have around how costly those legacy systems are to operate and maintain. Um, you should be looking at things and you should be asking hard questions of the vendor and saying, look, I need something where time to value is basically turnkey, because that's where the industry has moved to, right? If you're looking at a platform and that vendor has a conversation with you and says, well, it's going to take us, X months to deploy, and then we'll have to spend Y months in, migrating over your old system. And then, time to value, you should start seeing value and a return on your investment within 24 months. Keep looking. That is not the state of the art in modern IT tooling. It's just not. If you're looking at a modern system, that time to value should be very, very close to turnkey.
I want to bring up another area too to layer on all this, which is endpoint management, and this is one of those things where I think more and more we're starting to see technology leaders in the government say, okay, if you're adding another thing to the stack
Yeah.
here, you got to take some things away. What does that look like to you, and are you seeing the same thing that I just talked
Yes,
about?
100%. You'll hear it talked about with sort of different keywords associated with it. Um, I think some of the bigs, the Microsofts of the world and things, have done a very good job at getting people to start talking about the right subjects, which is, MDM, or mobile device management, has sort of grown, right? It started life as, I've got a bunch of people with smart devices, cell phones and things. How do I take it, those into account? How do I manage them and make sure that attack surface is secured and maintained? MDM has grown dramatically. It's now sort of become this catch-all for, I have lots of endpoints and I need to manage them. In reality, there's a lot more to that. MDM is part of it. RMM is part, right? Lots of acronym soup associated with it. But the reality is, again, going back to what does legacy look like? Legacy is that tool or that platform that says, look, I'm really, really good at managing this demographic of your end user devices. So Windows machines, Linux machines, Macs, right? And so what you'll see is a vendor comes to the table at renewal time and says, I've added some features. Good news, I have added I'm your endpoint management tool du jour. But I don't manage iOS devices. That's one of the more common ones that we see. So you're going to need this other tool to do that. But I've built integration with that other tool. Good news, right? When in reality, the answer should be, I am going to bend my product to manage your endpoints because I want to be your endpoint management tool. It's a very simple conversation. So either you do that or you don't. And if you don't, you're making excuses. And so if your vendor is coming to you and making those excuses, you need to have a hard conversation there, right? And this isn't, I'm not being, not being anti any particular vendor out there, but that's the reality is there was a lot of talk over the, maybe the past decade that the traditional endpoint is dying. The traditional endpoint is going away. It's now like we have this perimeterless world and everything's going to be virtual and whatnot. What we've actually seen, the reality is we've seen the number of endpoints, physical devices used by end users in government and private sector, almost triple in that time. So I think a lot of people really bought into that mantra of like, hey, days are numbered. We really don't have to worry about this. We'll keep limping along with what we have. And this utopian state is just around the corner where everyone is on virtual things and security will be inherent. And the reality is, like, we've expanded the attack surface across 3 times the devices that people are using now. And so, suddenly everybody woke up to the need for zero trust and things like that, which is all good, right? Um, there are lines of demarcation that are logical. I don't want my endpoint management tool to also necessarily be my endpoint detection tool, right? Like there does need to be a line of demarcation between functions, just for the sake of security. But that doesn't mean that there can't be overlap. I do want my endpoint management tool to be able to understand and be aware of what my security tooling is telling it so that it can then take action and those two things can work in synchronicity, right? But what I don't want is you to tell me, if I'm a government leader or decision maker, yep, I'm your endpoint management tool for 70% of your enterprise. and I can recommend some other things to get you to 100%, and I'll integrate with those other things. Just not the answer.
That sort of former vision that you talked about where everything's going to consolidate into a cloud and we're all just using thin clients out on the perimeter, that not coming to being in the way that you just talked about. I wonder what you think are sort of the backstories for why that didn't happen in the way it was envisioned. And is part of that just the fact, I shouldn't say fact, this is speculation on my part. Is part of that just that folks are still managing things that look more like thin clients in old ways that we manage things that aren't thin clients?
I think it's a combination of things. I do think that's part of it. But look, at the end of the day, when I do a lot of traveling, I spend a lot of time in airports and on airplanes, and there is a very strong argument to be made, and an awful lot of empirical evidence out there that people need pretty high horsepower compute capability that they can take with them wherever they go. I do think, in some ways we have seen that shift. Very few people are running, the majority of people, just as an example, are running, Office 365 or Google Workspace, where the app is cloud-based, right? It's not necessarily installed as a thick client app on their endpoint, but you still have to access it, right? And I'm going to access that from a traditional endpoint running an operating system that has an attack surface that needs patched, and it needs updated and upgraded, and it needs accounted for, and all the things that we do. And you look at what are the problems that are plaguing the government today in that world. Patching is part of the problem. That there have been a lot of advances and sort of better mousetraps built around. But what's always kind of fascinated me is you look at the problems that have plagued government the longest and made the least progress. And it's the really simple stuff like software asset management data, right? Like billions of dollars a year get spent trying to solve that problem. And like the very simple question of how do I get accurate software asset management data, or SAM data, into whatever my configuration management database of choice is, or my ITOM, or what have you. It's interesting to me that, number one, we have yet to solve that problem as an industry. It's still a garbage in, garbage out problem. Secondly, that problem has exacerbated, again, going back to, we've seen this explosion in the number of physical endpoints that people are using and accessing data from, and therefore need to be accounted for. But the third sort of pillar to that problem is that the second and third order effects of just simply not having good SAM data, which is just like where I'm honing in on one very simple thing here. But if you look at the extended effect of that, if I don't have a really good understanding of what's on the endpoint, whether they're running Office 365 in the cloud or what have you, that's all great. But if I don't have clean SAM data, that now causes problems with my vulnerability data, right? Is my vuln scan of the endpoint accurate? Well, if the SAM data that I have is not accurate, how can I be assured that the vuln data that I'm returned during a scan is accurate? And if I can't ensure that either of those are accurate, how do I know that my patch data is accurate? Right now, it starts calling into question everything you think you know about your enterprise. And again, I think that there's some of these are just sort of foundational first principles things that we need to go after and tackle. And I take that very seriously. Like I work every single day with people who we're focusing on, like, let's take a first principles approach to solving that SAM data problem. But at the same time, we do need to attack, like, what can we do in the meantime until we solve that $1 million problem, so to speak. And I think it's that's really what we need to get down to. There's two, and I'm, again, I don't want to come across as being critical of our competition or anything like that, but there is too many companies out there building features for the sake of building features and not taking a first principles approach to how do I solve the problem that is causing the pain that these people are experiencing, because they don't necessarily know that that's the root of the problem that they're describing. You get into this XY problem conundrum, which is super common in the federal space, it's super common in the commercial world too. It's our job to get to the source of that. And it's, as you can probably tell I'm very passionate about that, but I think that we just do a disservice to our customers by not taking a principles approach to that sort of thing.
Down to about our last 5 minutes here, and I want to make sure we get to a couple other issues before we have to let you go here. Let's talk about we've touched on some of the consolidation
Mhm.
demands. Another thing that's been a long-standing conversation in the federal government. Tell me where you see us in terms of federal IT consolidation needs, appetites within federal agencies
Yeah.
at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there is a very real appetite, and you see it. The tell for me, it's not just the conversations I'm having with people, which are very telling. They're very blunt and quite to the point that look, we have to reduce our spend. It's that simple. I also see it. I use the RFIs that are coming out as the bellwether there. That really informs me as to what the government's thinking about 1 year out, 2 years out, that sort of thing. And so I take those RFIs very seriously. I know a lot of vendors ignore RFIs. They wait for RFPs and they're chasing the dollar because that's their job. And credit to salespeople. Salespeople are always going to do their job. It's my job. If it's fun to say, wow, thought leader. If you're a thought leader, put the time in on reading and understanding those RFIs, asking questions of the author of those RFIs, whether you have to do that formally or you can do it informally, and then writing very thoughtful responses to those, because that's ultimately the government is asking for our help. They are coming to the community and saying, look, this is an area we need more information on. We need to know what good looks like because we don't necessarily, right? We're sort of myopic because we live in this space every single day. We know what's around us. We know what hurts, right? I know my elbow hurts, but I don't know why my elbow hurts, right? And that goes back to that first orders or first principles approach. And I think RFIs are the way that we can be informed and educated by the government to say what's really important to them. But it's that requires us to be very thoughtful to say, okay, reading this and understanding this, the patient is describing the symptom, right? I approach it the way a doctor approaches a patient, which is subjective, objective, right? Here's the subjective, it's an RFI. Now, objectively, I need to take what I know, having 35 years in the industry and having done, everything from boots on the ground, banging on the keyboard, spending nights troubleshooting problems, things like that, up through designing software and designing solutions for companies and things. And that RFI is the outlet for us to really communicate mutually in a way that is beneficial for all parties. And I think it's that that gives us the most well-informed approach to how we need to build our business as a vendor, and it gives the government the ability to approach the community of vendors in a safe way that sort of cuts out the marketing fluff. Ultimately, it benefits us as well because that's going to shape the RFP that will, logically speaking, an RFP will follow that RFI, and hopefully they incorporate some of those thoughts, right? Because we ultimately want to drive the government towards the best outcome for them and reducing that pain at the end of the day.
Completely took the words out of my mouth. I was just about to say it's kind of your best chance to influence whether you ultimately get an
Yeah,
RFP that makes sense.
that's right.
I want to make sure we get to one more thing before we go, and it's something that goes hand in hand with sort of the consolidation topic that we were talking
Mhm.
before. Shadow IT.
Yeah.
It's risen a little bit more to the fore in the last couple years, I feel like. But what are some of the best answers and some of the biggest questions you see on that front
Yeah.
right now?
Yeah, I'll tell you, it's tough. It goes back to that sort of that explosive growth of endpoint count. It has become much more difficult because of the sort of the erasure of the perimeter, right? Back in the day, you were concerned about shadow IT on your network. Today, we're concerned about shadow IT accessing resources, right? And those accesses are generally going to be, or often going to be outside in. So you don't have the same level of visibility that you've had in the past. There are technical answers to that. They range anywhere from, kind of the old school, let's do a network scan and see what's around us. But I think it also comes, and again, this goes back to the incumbency of vendors in different verticals to work together and share data. You think about, and you'll see this, vendors that have really done a good job of latching onto this, and I would argue we're one of those. I think CrowdStrike has done a phenomenal job of this. If you go to their integrations partner page, whatever they call it, where it lists like these are all of the external tooling that we can share data with bidirectionally, unidirectionally, whatever it is. Every vendor should, number one, should post that. Most do today. Every government person should look at that, because ultimately, if I'm going to tackle a problem that is as diverse as shadow IT, and understanding not just what's on my local network inside perimeter, but like what is that landscape of devices that are accessing any resources on my network, legitimately or illegitimately. The shadow IT, we're concerned about the legitimate ones. Solving that problem, gathering that data, and making that data understandable, turning data into information requires vendors to work together. And so I think that that's the real tell, is look to your vendor to say, yeah, you know what, that's a tough problem, requires a lot of cooperation between vendors. Here's the 11D7 different things that we can integrate with to help solve that problem as a collective.
All right. And unfortunately, we do need to leave it there for time. I want to thank our guest for this segment, Egon Rinderer, Senior Vice President for Federal and Enterprise Growth at NinjaOne. Thanks a lot, Egon.
Appreciate the time. Thank you.
I'm Jared Serbu, Federal News Network. Thanks for tuning in to the Cyber Leaders Exchange, and we'll send it back to the studio now.